I am Harrison Caldwell, 70 years old, a retired structural engineer. Until recently, I believed my family was safe. Last Tuesday, the illusion shattered. At 5 past midnight, my phone vibrated. It was my oldest son, Matthew. He is 38 and works for the FBI. Instead of a hello, his voice was a panicked, tactical whisper. Turn everything off. Go to the attic, lock the door, and do not tell Brad. Do it right now, Dad. I whispered that he was scaring me. He shouted to just do it. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever relied on gut instinct to protect your family. Building a life in Seattle meant everything to me. I spent 4 decades pouring my sweat into this 2-story house. Every load-bearing beam, hidden crawl space, and creaking floorboard was mapped in my mind. It was meant to be a fortress for my children. After my wife passed away, my youngest daughter Sarah and her husband Brad moved in to keep me company. Brad was 35, a real estate broker who always wore crisp shirts and an easy smile. I thought my home was a sanctuary. But as Matthew's dead dial tone echoed in my ear, the cold reality pressed in, choking the air out of my lungs. I did not turn on a single light. The silence suddenly felt heavy and predatory. I slipped out from under my quilt, my 70-year-old joints protesting the movement. I stood frozen in the pitch-black bedroom, trying to process the sheer terror in my son's command. Matthew was a seasoned federal agent. He dealt with the worst of humanity for a living. He did not panic. He did not make frantic midnight phone calls instructing his elderly father to hide from his own son-in-law unless the threat was already inside the walls. I moved into the hallway in absolute darkness. As an engineer, I knew the anatomy of this structure intimately. I knew exactly which oak floorboards would whine under my weight. I kept my back pressed against the plaster, sliding my socked feet along the edges where the joists offered the most solid support. The only sound was the frantic drumming of my heart against my ribs. Approaching their bedroom at the end of the hall, I slowed to a dead stop. The heavy door was pushed slightly ajar, letting a sliver of moonlight spill onto the carpet. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement. Soft, exhausted breathing drifted from the bed. But the cadence was wrong. It was only one set of lungs. Sarah was asleep, likely sedated by the migraine medication Brad had been insisting she take. Over the last 6 months, she had withered into a ghost. Brad convinced us it was chronic fatigue taking over her medical care. Now the heavier breathing of her husband was absent. Brad was not in bed. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. Where was the man who smiled at me over dinner just 3 hours ago? I crept away from their door and moved toward the utility closet in the center of the hallway. I reached up toward the ceiling panel. My hands, calloused from decades of drafting blueprints and inspecting steel girders, trembled violently as I pressed my palms flat against the wooden hatch. I pushed it upward, wincing at the faint scrape of wood against drywall. Grabbing the edges of the frame, I hauled my aging body up into the freezing void of the attic. The physical exertion tore through my shoulders, a sharp reminder that I was no longer a young man, but pure adrenaline masked the pain. I pulled my legs up and carefully lowered the heavy hatch back into its frame. My trembling fingers found the iron deadbolt I had installed years ago for security. I slid it shut. The metallic click sounded as loud as a gunshot. I was locked in securely. I sat back in the darkness, my chest heaving, trying to muffle the ragged sound of my own breathing. The air up here was terribly stale, thick with the smell of old fiberglass insulation and forgotten boxes. I wiped the sweat from my eyes, trying to make sense of the madness. Why was my federal agent's son telling me to hide from a real estate broker? What possible danger could a man who sells upscale condos pose to me in my own home? I needed to see. The attic spans the entire footprint of the house, extending directly over the attached 3-car garage on the northern wing. I lowered myself onto my stomach and began to crawl across the exposed wooden joists. I moved inch by inch on my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp fiberglass particles biting viciously into my forearms and the agonizing ache in my spine. I navigated through the labyrinth of wooden trusses and thick silver ventilation ducts, guided only by memory and the faint ambient glow leaking in through the roof vents. Decades ago, during a major renovation, I had intentionally left a small, unsealed ventilation gap near the edge of the garage ceiling. It was an engineering quirk designed to prevent moisture buildup during damp Seattle winters. I finally reached the far northern wall and flattened myself entirely against the cold plywood. I pressed my right eye to that narrow crack in the floorboards. Below me, the massive garage was bathed in the harsh light of the overhead fluorescent bulbs. The concrete floor was immaculate, but the scene unfolding upon it was absolute chaos. Down there was Brad. He was not wearing his silk pajamas, nor was he peacefully sleeping beside my daughter. He was dressed entirely in tactical black clothing, and he was not alone. My throat tightened in sheer terror. He was standing by the motorized garage door, which was raised just high enough to let a matte black cargo van back into the driveway. 3 unidentified men were moving with military precision out of the back of the vehicle. They were heavily armed, carrying tactical rifles strapped to their chests, their faces completely obscured by dark ballistic masks. Brad was whispering urgent commands to them, directing them toward the reinforced steel door that led directly down into my basement. I clamped a hand tightly over my mouth to stifle the gasp clawing at my throat. My son-in-law, the man who poured my coffee every morning, was orchestrating a heavily armed operation inside my home. My phone suddenly vibrated in my pocket, a harsh buzz that nearly made my heart stop. I pulled it out carefully. It was a single text message from Matthew received just before the cellular signal bars completely vanished from my illuminated screen. The message read, "My cover is blown. Do not trust the local police. You have to save Sarah yourself." The screen went completely dark. A jammer had been activated. I was entirely alone, trapped in the dusty attic of my own house, watching armed mercenaries march into my basement with no way to call for help. The harsh fluorescent lights of the garage flickered to life below me, casting sharp shadows across the concrete floor. I pressed my right eye to the narrow ventilation gap, holding my breath tightly. The dust of the attic clung to the sweat on my forehead, but I did not dare blink. My 70-year-old joints throbbed against the plywood, a dull ache spreading through my lower back. I ignored it completely. Every fiber of my being concentrated on the scene unfolding beneath my feet. The heavy motorized garage door, a system I personally installed 20 years ago, began to rise. It moved with eerie silence. Someone had recently oiled the tracks and replaced the tension springs without my knowledge. Brad. He must have done it while I was out tending the garden, preparing this space for what I was about to witness. The cool night air swept into the garage, bringing the distant sound of crickets from the woods. Then the matte black hood of a heavy cargo van crept into view. It backed into the space with deliberate precision, the engine purring with a low hum that spoke of expensive modifications. It was designed to move heavy loads quietly. The van eased into the center of the garage, its rear doors facing the interior entrance leading directly down into my basement. The engine cut off, and the silence was suffocating. I gripped the wooden edge of the gap, my mind struggling to process the impossible reality invading the sanctuary I built for my family. The rear doors of this van swung open with a controlled, smooth motion. 3 men stepped out into the harsh light. My stomach dropped. These were not common thieves looking for a quick score. They moved with a terrifying fluid coordination that I recognized immediately from my brief time serving in the military decades ago. They were professionals, mercenaries. Each man was clad in dark, unbranded tactical gear. Heavy ballistic vests covered their chests, and dark masks obscured their faces entirely, leaving only cold, focused eyes visible. Slung across their chests were compact, high-caliber rifles positioned perfectly for immediate deployment. They did not speak a single word to one another. There was no nervous chatter, no hesitation. They communicated through sharp, precise hand signals, securing the perimeter of the garage within seconds. My eyes darted from the armed men to the figure stepping out from the shadows near the interior door. It was Brad. The breath caught in my throat, forming a hard, painful knot. This was the man who had sat at my dining table just hours ago laughing about his real estate listings and praising my pot roast. This was the man who held my daughter's hand and called me Dad. But the person standing below me now was a complete stranger. The easygoing slouch, the warm smile, the deferential tone, they were all gone. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, radiating a cold, ruthless authority that chilled me to the bone. He was dressed in dark cargo pants and a black tactical fleece, a holstered sidearm strapped firmly to his right thigh. Brad raised a gloved hand, making a swift cutting motion toward the back of the van. The three masked men immediately moved to obey his silent command. They reached into the dark interior of the cargo hold and began to pull out massive black metal crates. The heavy-duty suspension of the van groaned and lifted slightly as the weight was removed, telling my engineering mind that whatever was inside those boxes was incredibly dense. They hauled the first crate onto a reinforced hand truck. As they tilted it back, one of the heavy metal latches slipped open, just a fraction. A draft of air caught the scent from below and carried it up through the ventilation gap directly into my face. I gagged, clamping my hand over my mouth just in time to stop a cough. The smell was overpowering. It was a sharp, caustic reek of industrial chemical solvents, the kind used to strip paint or dissolve organic matter. But beneath that harsh chemical burn lay something much worse, a heavy, sickly sweet, unmistakable stench of iron. It was the smell of blood. Massive quantities of it. Bile rose in my throat as my mind raced, trying to shut out the horrifying implications of those crates. What had my son-in-law brought into my home? What was he hiding in the basement, where my daughter slept? Just 2 floors above. Brad stepped closer to the men, his face twisted in a severe, unforgiving scowl. He finally spoke, his voice a harsh, guttural whisper that carried perfectly up to my hiding place. Keep it steady. If any of those seals break and this floor gets contaminated, you are the ones who will be cleaning it up with your own clothes. Get it into the basement vault now. Move. He barked the order with a venomous edge. The men nodded sharply in unison and pushed the heavy cart toward the reinforced steel door leading down to the basement. I watched them roll the absolute nightmare directly into my home. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them flat against the floorboards. Just as the last masked man cleared the doorway, my cellular phone vibrated heavily in my front pocket. It was a single sustained buzz, a harsh shock against my leg. I slowly reached into my pocket, terrified the faint glow of the screen might betray my position. I cupped my hand over the device, shielding the light. It was a text message from Matthew. My eyes scanned the words, and the warmth left in my body vanished. The message read, "My cover is blown. Do not trust the local police. You have to save Sarah yourself." I stared at the glowing letters, the reality of my son's desperate situation crashing down. Matthew was out there, his life in peril, trusting me to protect his sister. I quickly typed a reply asking what I needed to do. I hit send immediately. The loading circle spun for a second before a red exclamation point appeared. Message failed to send. I looked at the top corner of the screen. The cellular signal bars were completely gone. The screen displayed a stark message: no service. I frantically toggled the airplane mode on and off. Nothing changed. The Wi-Fi icon disappeared next. The truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. Brad had activated a signal jammer. The house was isolated from the outside world. There would be no calling emergency services. There would be no checking in on Matthew. I was a 70-year-old man entirely alone, trapped in a dusty attic above heavily armed mercenaries and a son-in-law who was a violent criminal orchestrator. I turned my phone off and slid it back into my pocket. The paralyzing fear slowly began to burn away, replaced by cold clarity. Brad thought he was using an old man's house as a safe haven. He thought I was completely blind and defenseless. He was about to find out exactly how incredibly wrong he truly was. The rest of the night passed in a slow, agonizing crawl. I remained flattened against the rough plywood of the attic floor, listening to the heavy thuds and scraping sounds echoing from the garage below. Every noise sent a fresh wave of dread through my veins, but I forced myself to stay absolutely still. I tracked the movements by the vibrations in the floor joists. It took them nearly 2 hours to transfer those massive foul-smelling crates down into my basement. When the cargo van finally reversed out of the driveway and the motorized garage door glided shut, the house fell into a deafening silence. I did not move. I knew better than to act prematurely. I waited until the first faint streaks of dawn began to bleed through the roof vents, painting the attic dust in a pale, ghostly light. My joints were completely locked up, screaming in protest as I slowly pushed myself up from the floorboards. Every muscle in my 70-year-old body ached with a deep, punishing stiffness, but I could not afford weakness right now. I crept back toward the utility closet hatch, lowering myself down into the hallway with excruciating care. The silence of the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. I slipped quietly into my bedroom, peeled off my dust-covered clothes, and took a quick hot shower to wash away the fiberglass and the lingering stench of chemical solvents. I dressed in my usual morning attire, a faded flannel shirt and comfortable slacks, carefully constructing the facade of the harmless, oblivious old man Brad believed me to be. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, taking a long, hard look at my reflection. The gray hair, the deep lines etched around my mouth, the tired eyes. I needed to leverage every bit of my perceived frailty. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart, and opened my bedroom door. The familiar aroma of freshly ground coffee drifted up the staircase, thick and rich. On any other day, it would have been a comforting scent. Today, it felt like bait. I walked down the carpeted stairs, intentionally dragging my feet just a fraction more than usual, letting my slippers scuff against the steps to announce my arrival. I wanted him to hear me coming. I wanted him to see a fragile retiree shuffling down for his morning cup. As I turned the corner into the open-concept kitchen, I saw him. Brad was standing confidently at the polished granite island, casually pouring steaming dark roast into 2 matching ceramic mugs. He was dressed flawlessly, as always. He wore a crisp, light blue designer button-down shirt, the sleeves neatly rolled up to reveal his ridiculously expensive silver watch. Not a single strand of his perfectly groomed hair was out of place this morning. There was no trace of the tactical gear, no lingering scent of bleach or iron, no sign of the ruthless commander I had watched from the attic just hours ago. He looked up as I entered the kitchen and flashed that bright, easy smile that had charmed my daughter into marrying him. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice smooth and incredibly warm. "I made your favorite roast." I forced my tense facial muscles to relax, offering a gentle, very tired smile in return. "Good morning, Brad," I softly replied, my voice slightly raspy, perfectly matching the weak character I needed to play. "Smells wonderful." I walked over to the counter and took the mug he offered, letting my hands tremble just a tiny bit as I grasped the warm ceramic. Brad leaned against the counter, casually crossing his ankles. Before I could even ask a mundane question about the day, he preemptively launched into his explanation. "I wanted to apologize if there was any noise last night that disturbed your sleep," he said, his tone dripping with practiced sincerity. My real estate office had a massive pipe burst right above the server room around 1 a.m. It was a complete disaster. I had to pay an emergency moving crew triple their rate to haul all our server racks out of the building to save the data. I told them to just bring everything here and put it down in the basement temporarily until the water damage at the office is sorted out. The lie was so incredibly smooth, so perfectly constructed, that for a split second, a normal person might have actually believed it. It explained the late-night activity. It explained the heavy crates. It explained the unfamiliar men. It was the absolute perfect cover story designed to pacify an old man who supposedly knew nothing about modern technology or the dark underbelly of the world. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the warm liquid soothe my dry throat. "Oh my goodness, that sounds terrible," I said, injecting just the right amount of grandfatherly concern into my voice. "A pipe burst is an absolute nightmare. Did they manage to save all your important files?" Brad nodded earnestly, taking a sip from his own mug. "Thankfully, yes. We got everything out just in time. The guys were a bit loud bringing the heavy racks down the basement stairs, so I really hope we did not wake you or Sarah up." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. "You know me, Brad. Once my head hits the pillow, I sleep like a log." I did not hear a single thing all night long. Brad visibly relaxed. The slight tension in his shoulders completely melted away. He fully believed he had me fooled. He fully believed his lie had secured his operation. "Well, I am just glad everything is safe." I continued shuffling slowly past the kitchen island, toward the hallway that led to the utility rooms. I am going to grab the morning paper from the porch. I took my time, keeping my posture slightly stooped. As I passed the doorway that opened up to the basement stairwell, I casually glanced to my right. My heart performed a violent stutter step against my ribs, but I did not break my slow, shuffling stride. The standard wooden door leading down to my basement, the door I had installed with my own hands 30 years ago, had been radically altered overnight. A thick, heavy-duty industrial padlock now secured a massive steel hasp that had been drilled directly into the doorframe. But it was not just a simple lock. Sitting just above the heavy steel chain was a sleek, modern biometric fingerprint scanner wired cleanly into the wall. My mind raced, calculating the implications. Brad was not just storing crates down there. He was securing a fortress within my own home, cutting off my access to the very foundation of my house. I continued walking toward the front door, maintaining my oblivious facade. Brad truly thought he had locked his darkest secrets away safely in the dark. He did not realize that a locked door to a seasoned structural engineer is merely an open invitation to find the hidden structural vulnerabilities of the house. I forced my gaze away from the biometric scanner and the heavy steel hasp, turning my attention back toward the kitchen. The soft padding of footsteps on the carpeted staircase drew my focus. I braced myself, leaning heavily on the polished granite countertop, projecting the image of a tired old man simply enjoying his morning routine. The figure that slowly rounded the corner into the morning sunlight, however, nearly shattered my carefully constructed facade. It was my youngest daughter, Sarah. But the woman standing before me was a hollow shell of the vibrant, energetic girl I had raised. She moved with a slow, mechanical stiffness, dragging her feet across the hardwood floor, as if wading through deep water. Her usually bright complexion was replaced by a sickly, translucent pallor. Her skin stretched far too tightly over her cheekbones. Dark, bruised shadows hollowed out the space beneath her eyes, making them look sunken and enormous in her gaunt face. Her thick brown hair, normally so meticulously kept, hung in limp, unbrushed strands around her shoulders. She wore a heavy woolen sweater despite the warmth of the house, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso, as if trying to hold herself together. My heart physically ached at the sight of her. As a structural engineer, I had spent my entire professional life evaluating the integrity of buildings, looking for microscopic stress fractures, signs of uneven settling, and hidden corrosion. Looking at my daughter now, all I saw was a foundation on the absolute verge of complete collapse. She was not just tired. She was actively deteriorating right in front of my eyes. Her gaze, usually so sharp and full of life, was completely vacant. She stared straight ahead, but her eyes seemed to look right through the kitchen walls, disconnected from the reality of the room. She blinked slowly, her eyelids fluttering, as if simply keeping them open required a monumental effort. I wanted to drop my coffee mug, run to her, and shake her awake. I wanted to demand answers, to ask her what he was doing to her. But the memory of the armed men in my garage and Matthew's frantic midnight warning anchored my feet to the floor. I had to remain the oblivious, harmless father. I swallowed the thick knot of rage forming in my throat and forced a warm, gentle smile onto my face. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice light and entirely cheerful. Sarah barely registered my greeting. Her head turned toward me with agonizing slowness, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came out. Before she could even attempt to form a word, Brad was instantly at her side. He swooped in with the terrifying grace of a predatory bird, smoothly wrapping a strong arm around her frail waist. He pulled her flush against his side, his hand resting possessively on her hip. His touch was firm, restricting her movement, under the guise of supporting her weak frame. "Morning, Sarah," Brad said, pressing a tender kiss to the side of her head. He looked over at me, his expression melting into a mask of deep husbandly concern. "Her migraines are acting up again today, Dad. It is a really bad episode this time. She barely slept a wink last night." The lie slid effortlessly from his tongue, completely ignoring the fact that I had stood outside their bedroom door hours ago, listening to her solitary, sedated breathing, while he was downstairs, managing a criminal syndicate. Brad rubbed her shoulder gently, playing the role of the devoted caretaker to absolute perfection. "I have her on a strict regimen to manage the pain." Brad continued, his tone smooth and reassuring. "Her regular doctor prescribed some standard painkillers, but they were just not doing the trick. They were leaving her too groggy. So I consulted with a specialist in the city. I got her a new heavy-duty herbal medication. It is all natural, very potent, and specifically designed to target severe neurological inflammation. It makes her a bit lethargic while her body adjusts to the new compounds, but she just needs plenty of deep rest." I nodded slowly, maintaining my performance. I let a look of mild paternal worry wash over my features. "Well, chronic migraines are a terrible burden to carry," I said, taking another sip of my coffee. "You are a good man for taking such diligent care of her, Brad. Just make sure she stays hydrated with those new herbal supplements. Sometimes they can dry you out." Brad smiled warmly, clearly pleased that I had swallowed his fabricated medical explanation without a single question. "Absolutely, Dad. In fact, I was just about to pour her a large glass of iced lemon water to take with her morning dosage." Brad gently guided Sarah toward one of the tall wooden bar stools at the kitchen island, easing her down onto the seat. "Stay right here, honey. Let me grab that water for you," he murmured. Brad released his grip on her waist, turned his back to us, and walked the few short steps toward the stainless steel refrigerator to use the water dispenser. It was a window of exactly 5 seconds. The moment Brad's eyes were diverted, Sarah's entire demeanor shifted. The drug-induced haze seemed to fracture just enough to let her true panic bleed through. Her arm shot out with a sudden, desperate speed. Her cold, trembling fingers clamped down viciously onto the fabric of my flannel sleeve. The physical strength behind her grip was shocking, fueled entirely by pure terror. I froze, looking down at her hand, then up into her face. Her eyes were wide, completely dilated, and screaming with a silent, frantic urgency. She did not utter a single syllable. She did not dare make a sound. But as she stared into my eyes, her message was deafening. It was a raw, primal plea for salvation. She knew. She knew she was in terrible danger. She knew the medication was a lie, a chemical leash designed to keep her docile and entirely compliant while her husband operated his illicit empire beneath our feet. I placed my large, calloused hand over her trembling fingers, giving them a single firm squeeze of absolute reassurance. I looked deeply into her terrified eyes, silently promising her that I understood that I was not the oblivious old fool Brad believed me to be. The ice dispenser on the refrigerator stopped humming. The brief window of opportunity was instantly closed. Sarah quickly snatched her hand away from my sleeve, folding her arms back across her chest, just as Brad turned around, holding a glass of water. His sharp eyes darted between us for a microsecond, a fleeting flash of cold suspicion, scanning the space before his warm smile returned. "Here you go, sweetheart," Brad said, pressing the glass into her hands. "Drink up, and then we are going right back upstairs to bed. The basement construction will be noisy later, and you need a quiet environment." He gently but firmly pulled her up from the stool, ushering her away from me, isolating my daughter again in her upstairs prison while the real nightmare waited below. I watched Brad guide my daughter up the staircase, his hand resting on the small of her back. The floorboards creaked under their combined weight, a familiar sound in this old house, but today it sounded like the closing of a prison cell. I stood alone in the kitchen, the silence pressing in on me from every corner. My coffee had gone completely cold. I poured it down the sink, gripping the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turned white. My instinct, the primal urge of a father, was to march up those stairs, tear that door off its hinges, and drag my daughter out of this house. But the memory of those armed mercenaries in the garage anchored me to reality. If I confronted Brad now, without a weapon, without a plan, and without outside contact, I would simply be signing both of our death warrants. I needed to be smart. I needed to use the only advantage I had left, the fact that Brad still thought I was an oblivious, harmless old man. I grabbed the edges of the plastic trash bag lining the kitchen bin, tying it off with deliberate, slow movements. I hoisted it over my shoulder and shuffled toward the side door leading to the garage. The heavy fire door clicked shut behind me, plunging me into the cool, damp air of the garage. The scent of chemical solvents and iron had dissipated, masked by the smell of motor oil and sawdust, but my mind could still see the phantom shapes of those black metal crates resting on the concrete. I dropped the trash bag into the large bin, making sure to let the lid slam shut with a loud, hollow thud. I wanted anyone listening to believe I was simply going about my mundane morning chores. I turned my attention to the center of the room. Parked perfectly between my old workbench and the wall was Brad's vehicle. It was a late-model luxury SUV painted a sleek, glossy black. He had brought it home 2 months ago, claiming his real estate firm had given him a massive bonus for closing a commercial property deal. It was ostentatious, but it fit the persona of a highly successful broker. Now, however, viewing it through the lens of what I had witnessed the night before, the vehicle looked entirely different. It did not look like a status symbol. It looked like a tactical asset. I slowly walked around the perimeter of the vehicle, my structural engineer background kicking in. For 40 years, my job was to look at physical objects and determine their load-bearing capacity, their stress points, and their hidden weaknesses. I stopped by the driver's side door and looked closely at the hinges. They were abnormally thick, reinforced with heavy-grade steel brackets that you would never find on a standard civilian car. The door itself sat lower on the chassis, suggesting it weighed significantly more than a normal door. I ran my calloused fingertips along the rubber weather stripping sealing the window. It was incredibly dense, overlapping the glass by almost a full inch. I leaned in closer, my face inches from the dark-tinted window. The surface was impeccably clean, polished to a mirror shine, but as I adjusted my angle to catch the morning light filtering through the garage slats, I saw it. Right near the bottom corner of the driver's side window, barely visible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, was an imperfection. It was not a scratch from a stray pebble or a crack from a temperature shift. It was a precise, localized cluster of microscopic spiderweb fractures. I pressed my thumb against the glass. It was cool and unnervingly thick. The fracture pattern radiated outward from a central point of impact in a perfect uniform geometry. I had seen this exact stress pattern before during government contract work, evaluating structural integrity for secure facilities. This was ballistic glass, composed of alternating layers of tough polycarbonate and lead glass. And that tiny star-shaped blemish was the unmistakable signature of a high-velocity impact that had been successfully absorbed and distributed across the panel. Someone had recently fired a suppressed weapon directly at the driver's side window, and the armor had done its job. Real estate agents showing suburban family homes do not drive heavily armored, bulletproof tactical vehicles. They do not take suppressed gunfire to their driver's side windows. The reality of who my daughter had married slammed into me with the force of a freight train. Brad was not a simple white-collar criminal involved in some shady accounting scheme. He was operating at a level of violence and paranoia that required military-grade protection just to commute. He was deeply entrenched in a brutal, unforgiving world, and he had deliberately anchored his operations inside my home using my daughter as his perfect, innocent cover. The sick, twisted brilliance of it made my stomach churn. No federal agency would ever suspect a violent cartel operator to be living quietly under the roof of a retired engineer married to the sister of an active FBI agent. It was the ultimate blind spot. But the blind spot had just collapsed. Matthew knew. Somehow my son had discovered the truth and his cover had been blown. I had to assume that the people Brad worked for were actively hunting Matthew right now. I needed to get a message out. I needed to warn Matthew that I knew the truth, that Sarah was sedated and trapped, and that Brad had brought an armed crew into the basement. My cellular phone was useless against the jammer Brad had activated, but my eyes fell upon the old yellowed landline telephone mounted to the wall above my workbench. I had kept the physical copper line active out of sheer stubborn habit, much to Brad's constant amusement. A digital jammer blocks radio frequencies and cellular signals, but it cannot sever a hardwired underground copper connection. I quickly shuffled over to the workbench, grabbing a rag to pretend I was wiping down my tools just in case a hidden camera was watching me. I positioned my body to block the view of the wall phone from the rest of the garage. My hands were slick with cold sweat as I reached up and carefully lifted the heavy plastic receiver from its cradle. I brought it to my ear, desperately praying for the familiar, steady hum of a dial tone. I waited for the sound of connection, the sound of hope, the sound of a lifeline to the outside world. I closed my eyes and pressed the speaker tightly against my ear. But there was no hum. There was no static. There was absolutely nothing at all. The line was entirely dead. It was a thick, heavy silence that spoke louder than any threat. Brad had not just jammed the airwaves, he had physically cut the copper lines leading out of the property. The realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. We were completely cut off from the entire world. There was absolutely no escape from this nightmare. I carefully placed the dead telephone receiver back onto its plastic cradle, ensuring it did not make even the faintest click. The realization that I was entirely marooned inside my own home settled deep into my bones, bringing with it a chilling clarity. The severed copper line was not a mere precaution. It was a deliberate act of isolation. Brad had systematically cut every digital and physical tether binding this property to the outside world. I took a slow, deep breath, steadying the tremor in my hands. Panic was a luxury I simply could not afford. I had to get to Sarah. I had to find a window of opportunity to pull my daughter aside, wake her from whatever chemical fog Brad had forced her into, and devise a plan to get her out of the house safely. I walked back through the heavy fire door and stepped into the kitchen. The morning sunlight streamed through the bay windows, casting warm pools across the hardwood floors, creating a sickeningly domestic illusion. I moved toward the staircase, intent on heading upstairs, but my path was immediately blocked. Brad was descending the stairs, his arm once again firmly wrapped around Sarah's waist. He was practically carrying her down. Sarah looked even worse than she had an hour ago. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her eyes half closed, completely unresponsive to the world around her. I stepped forward, extending my hands toward her. "Let me help you with her, Brad," I said, keeping my voice gentle, projecting the image of a concerned father. "She looks terribly weak. Why do you not let her rest in the living room while I make her some warm broth?" Brad sidestepped my approach, pulling Sarah closer to his chest. He flashed that immaculate, hollow smile. "Oh, no need to trouble yourself, Dad," he replied smoothly. "The new medication makes her incredibly sensitive to light and movement. The specialist was very clear that she needs absolute quiet and zero stimulation. I am just taking her to the downstairs den so I can keep a close eye on her while I handle some paperwork." I followed them into the den, my mind racing for an excuse to separate them. Brad lowered her onto the plush sofa, instantly tucking a thick blanket around her shoulders. I stepped to the other side of the couch, reaching to brush a stray lock of hair from my daughter's forehead. "Sarah, honey," I murmured, hoping the sound of my voice might anchor her. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a fraction of a second, her gaze locked onto mine. The raw, unadulterated fear I saw swirling in those clouded pupils nearly broke my composure. Brad's hand suddenly clamped down onto my wrist. His grip was entirely too tight for a casual gesture. It was a physical warning. The friendly son-in-law facade slipped for just a microsecond, revealing the cold, calculating predator beneath. "I really must insist on keeping her environment completely undisturbed, Dad," he said, his voice dropping half an octave, carrying a subtle razor-sharp edge. "The doctor said any stress could trigger a massive relapse. It is best if you just leave us be for the morning. I am sure you have gardening to attend to." I looked down at his hand encircling my wrist. I felt the immense coiled strength in his forearm. I knew that if I pushed the issue right now, he would escalate the situation, and I was in no physical condition to fight a heavily armed man 35 years my junior. I slowly pulled my arm back, giving a hesitant, defeated nod. "Of course, Brad," I whispered, playing the part of the cowed, obedient elder. "You know best. I will go check on the flower beds. Call me if she needs anything at all." I turned and walked away, feeling his intense gaze boring into my back until I stepped out the front door. The cool morning breeze hit my face, but it offered no relief. Brad was not going to leave her side for a single second. He was guarding his hostage in plain sight. I walked down the porch steps and moved slowly toward the side of the house, maintaining the slow, aimless shuffle of a man inspecting his rose bushes. In reality, my engineering mind was furiously calculating my next tactical move. If I could not access my daughter, I needed to understand the exact nature of the operation Brad was running beneath my feet. I rounded the corner of the brick foundation, moving out of the direct line of sight from the den windows. I approached the heavy gray utility box mounted to the exterior wall. It housed the main electrical meter and the primary breaker panel for the entire property. When I designed this home, I installed an upgraded commercial-grade electrical intake to support my heavy power tools and the large air compressor in the garage. It was a robust system. I flipped open the metal cover of the meter box. My breath hitched in my throat. The digital smart meter readout was completely erratic. The numbers tracking the kilowatt-hour usage were climbing at a violent, impossible speed. The digital dial was spinning so fast it was almost a blur. I stared at the readout, my mind instantly running the mathematical conversions. The sheer volume of electrical current surging into my basement was astronomical. It was not the power draw of a few dozen server racks, as Brad had claimed. Servers certainly draw power for cooling and processing, but this load was entirely different. The amperage required to move that meter at that specific velocity was staggering. Whatever Brad and those masked men had unloaded from the cargo van was drawing enough raw electricity to run a medium-sized industrial manufacturing floor. I needed more data. I closed the utility box and moved further down the side of the house, sinking down onto my hands and knees in the damp soil. The thick hydrangeas provided ample cover from the street. I crawled toward the heavy cast iron grating that covered the primary ventilation exhaust pipe for the basement. I had specifically engineered this dedicated exhaust line decades ago to vent chemical fumes from my old woodworking stains and varnishes directly outside, keeping the air in the main house pure. I pressed the side of my face against the cold, damp brick of the foundation and placed my right ear directly over the iron grate. I closed my eyes, tuning out the rustling leaves and the distant traffic, focusing every ounce of my concentration on the acoustic signatures traveling up the metal pipe from the locked room below. If Brad were truly running data servers, I would hear the distinct, high-pitched, continuous whine of dozens of computer cooling fans, accompanied by a steady, monotonous hum. But the sounds echoing up the iron shaft were completely wrong. Instead of a mere digital hum, I heard a heavy, rhythmic, mechanical thumping. It was a rapid, percussive sequence. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound paused for exactly 2 seconds. They were running industrial currency counters and a high-grade chemical filtration system. The mechanical clicking of industrial currency counters and the low thrum of a high-grade chemical filtration system echoed against my eardrum. I pulled my face away from the cold iron grating, the damp soil clinging to the knees of my trousers. The reality of the situation was no longer a series of unsettling suspicions or strange coincidences. It was a concrete, quantifiable fact. Brad was running a massive illicit financial operation right under my feet, likely washing millions of dollars in cartel cash, while my daughter lay drugged and helpless just 2 floors above. I brushed the dirt from my clothes, taking a moment to steady my breathing before stepping back out from the cover of the heavy hydrangeas. I shuffled back to the front porch, retrieved the morning newspaper from the welcome mat, and walked through the front door, maintaining the slow, deliberate pace of a tired old man with absolutely nowhere to be. Brad was still safely occupied in the downstairs den, standing guard over Sarah, under the guise of husbandly concern. I needed to hear exactly what was being discussed in that basement fortress. I needed a clear audio line, and I knew exactly how to get it without tripping the biometric lock on the main door. When I built this house 30 years ago, I personally designed and installed the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. I knew every inch of the ductwork, every return vent, and every structural cavity hidden behind the drywall. I moved silently past the den, careful not to cast a single shadow across the open doorway, and slipped into the main floor utility corridor. I opened the heavy, solid core door to the primary HVAC closet and stepped inside, gently pulling the door shut until it clicked softly into the frame. The closet was pitch black, smelling faintly of metallic dust and old fiberglass insulation. I did not turn on the overhead bulb. I let my eyes adjust to the darkness, relying on my intimate knowledge of the space I had framed with my own hands. I reached up toward the large return air grate positioned near the ceiling. With practiced precision, I unlatched the painted metal grate, sliding it aside with absolute silence. I reached into the cavity and carefully removed the thick pleated air filter, setting it gently on top of the water heater. This specific return duct did not snake through the walls like the others. It dropped straight down through the wooden floor joists, bypassing the insulation barriers, and connected directly to the main galvanized trunk line situated in the exact center of the basement ceiling. By removing the thick particulate filter, I had essentially created a direct, unobstructed acoustic tube leading straight into the heart of Brad's hidden operation. I pulled over a sturdy plastic step stool, climbed onto it, and pressed my right ear directly inside the cold metal opening of the duct. The acoustics were incredible. The smooth galvanized steel acted as a giant amplifier, capturing the ambient noise from the basement and channeling it straight up into the closet. The rhythmic rapid-fire snapping of the currency counters was significantly louder now, a relentless mechanical chatter that spoke of millions of dollars moving through my home. I heard the muffled heavy footsteps of the masked mercenaries pacing across the concrete floor, their tactical boots scuffing against the surface. I held my breath, closing my eyes to focus entirely on the auditory feed. Suddenly, the mechanical snapping of the currency machines abruptly stopped. The heavy steel door at the bottom of the basement stairs creaked open, its heavy hinges groaning under the weight. Someone had just walked down from the main floor. It was Brad. I recognized the distinctive, confident cadence of his footsteps striking the concrete. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing the basement once again. I heard the faint digital chirp of a cellular device connecting to a network. Brad had stepped into the basement specifically to bypass his own signal jammer and use a secure line. I pressed my ear harder against the cold edge of the duct, straining to catch every single syllable. When Brad finally spoke, his voice was entirely stripped of the warm, charming tone he used with my daughter. It was flat, cold, and strictly professional, the voice of a man conducting ruthless business. "Yes, the shipment arrived cleanly," Brad said, his words echoing perfectly up the metal shaft. "The counters are processing the bulk right now. We are right on schedule. The new location is completely secure. No one followed the transport team, and the local authorities have zero presence in this sector." There was a brief pause as Brad listened to the voice on the other end of the secure line. I gripped the edges of the metal duct, my knuckles turning white. The person Brad was speaking to was clearly someone of high authority, someone demanding precise updates. Brad's tone shifted, becoming slightly more deferential, but remaining chillingly detached. "Yes, I understand the complication with the agent," Brad continued. "I have the situation under complete control on this end. The old man is clueless. He suspects nothing at all. He thinks I am storing computer servers down here because of a pipe burst at the office. He is just a harmless, gullible retiree. He bought the story without a single question." My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. Hearing him dismiss me so casually, so arrogantly, fueled a dark, burning fire in the pit of my stomach. But his next words froze the blood in my veins. "And my wife is heavily sedated," Brad stated, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy. "She will not be a problem. She is locked in a chemically induced sleep and will remain completely compliant until the extraction is finished. The operation is insulated. Now, what is the status of the target?" Another long, agonizing pause followed. I could hear the faint rhythmic tapping of Brad's expensive leather shoes against the concrete floor as he waited for the response. When he spoke again, the sheer malice in his words was paralyzing. "Excellent," Brad said, a dark satisfaction coloring his tone. "Make sure the hit is clean. Leave absolutely no trace back to us. Once we get confirmation that the FBI agent is dead, I will initiate the final phase here." A wave of profound nausea washed over me. He was talking about Matthew. He was casually ordering the assassination of his own brother-in-law, the man trying to bring down his cartel network. Matthew was out there right now being hunted by professional killers, directed by the man standing in my basement. I squeezed my eyes shut silently, praying for my son's survival, fighting the overwhelming urge to scream. But Brad was not finished. The true horror of his master plan was about to be laid bare. "As soon as I receive the secure confirmation that Matthew is eliminated, I will trigger an electrical fire upstairs in the main house," Brad explained, his voice cold and methodical. "The wiring in this place is old. It will look like a tragic accidental short circuit. The old man and Sarah will burn with the house. It is the absolute perfect cover to move the laundered cash out tonight. While the local fire department and the police are busy dealing with a massive residential blaze and recovering 2 charred bodies, my transport team will be miles away with the shipment. The house burning down ties up all the loose ends perfectly." The call abruptly ended with a sharp digital click. Brad's heavy footsteps moved away from the center of the room, followed immediately by the rapid mechanical snapping of the currency counters roaring back to life. I slowly pulled my head out of the ventilation duct, stepping down from the plastic stool on trembling legs. The air in the dark utility closet felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. I leaned my back against the water heater, sliding down until I hit the floor. The chilling reality of my situation crushed down upon me with an unbearable weight. Brad was not just hiding money in my basement. He was preparing a tomb. My home, the sanctuary I had painstakingly built to protect my family, was going to be our funeral pyre. He had planned this meticulously. Sarah was chemically paralyzed, completely unable to save herself. Matthew was marked for imminent death, actively hunted by cartel mercenaries. And I was supposed to be the oblivious casualty, an old man caught in a tragic accidental fire. I looked down at my wrinkled hands, calloused from decades of hard labor. I had spent my entire life constructing buildings, ensuring they could withstand enormous pressure and catastrophic events. Now I had to deconstruct the man trying to destroy my family. I glanced at my watch. The sun was fully up. I realized with absolute terrifying certainty that I only had a few short hours left to live. The certainty of my death did not paralyze me. The cold utility closet felt less like a tomb and more like a staging ground. The overwhelming waves of fear evaporated, replaced by a cold focus. I was not a trained soldier. I had no experience. But I was a structural engineer. For over 4 decades, I had designed systems meant to withstand hurricanes, earthquakes, and failures. I knew how pressure worked. I knew how circuits flowed. I knew how to make a stable environment tear itself apart. This house was my design, my domain, and my fortress. Brad had rented space within my walls. He was about to learn the fatal consequence of disrespecting the architect. I listened to the house. Brad was moving on the main floor, his boots echoing. I cracked the utility closet door, peering through the narrow slit. Brad was standing near the front foyer, pulling a tactical jacket over his shoulders. He was speaking into his phone. "Tell the patrol cruisers to hold their position at the county line," Brad ordered. "I am heading out to meet the police escort to finalize the routing protocol. I will be back in 30 minutes. Do not let anyone approach the property until I return." He terminated the call, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. The deadbolt clicked into place. I heard the engine of his vehicle roar to life and the tires crunch against the gravel as he sped away. 30 minutes. That was my window of opportunity. I pushed the closet door open and stepped out into the hallway. Most men would have rushed to the bedroom, packed a bag, and fled through the woods. I did not glance toward the bedrooms. Fleeing would leave my daughter to burn and my son to be hunted down. Running was not an option. Instead, I moved toward the garage. I walked to the metal toolboxes against the back wall. These contained instruments of creation and destruction. I unlocked the steel drawers, pulling out rolls of insulated copper wire strippers, electrical tape, and specialized pipe wrenches. The familiar weight of the cold metal in my hands grounded me. I carried the tools back inside the house, moving with a speed I had not felt in 20 years. I headed straight for the primary electrical panel in the hallway alcove. Brad planned to trigger an electrical fire to cover his tracks and incinerate my family. I was going to give him an electrical event, but it would be on my terms. I unscrewed the faceplate of the breaker box and set it aside. The maze of multicolored wires and copper bus bars was laid bare before me. To a layman, it was a jumble of colored wires. To me, it was a logical map of energy. I went to work on those main intake lines. Brad's men in the basement were drawing power to run their currency counters and chemical scrubbers. I bypassed the safety relays, severing the grounding wires. I spliced a secondary circuit into the main feed, routing the current away from the standard breakers and linking it to a centralized switch hidden beneath the floorboards in the dining room. If Brad tried to trigger a fire, he would find the system unresponsive to his commands. When I decided to flip my hidden switch, the ungrounded electrical load of the house would surge back into the basement, delivering an arc of voltage directly into their equipment. It would be a catastrophic power surge, devastating to their electronics. With the electrical trap set behind the faceplate, I grabbed my pipe wrenches and moved to the utility room near the kitchen. This room housed the main water distribution manifold for the property. The house sat on a high-pressure municipal water line, which required pressure-reducing valves to prevent the pipes from bursting. I crouched beside the array of copper and brass plumbing. I applied the heavy wrench to the primary pressure regulator muscles, straining as I broke the seal on the locking nut. I began to twist the central adjustment bolt, opening the valve wider and wider. I was intentionally compromising the structural integrity of the plumbing network. I bypassed the secondary safety release valves, forcing the municipal water pressure to bypass the regulators and build up directly against the closed fixtures throughout the house. The pipes hidden behind the drywall immediately began to groan and shudder under the immense unnatural strain. I adjusted the flow just enough so that the pipes would hold for now, hovering on the absolute razor edge of a catastrophic rupture. The moment a specific major valve was opened, the sudden drop in resistance would cause a violent high-pressure water hammer effect, instantly shattering the joints and flooding the lower levels with thousands of gallons of water in minutes. I was turning the very veins of the house into a pressurized weapon. I wiped the thick grease from my hands onto the fabric of my work pants, my breathing heavy but strictly controlled. I had successfully rigged the electricity. I had successfully weaponized the plumbing. I had taken the very structural foundation of this property and aggressively armed it against the hostile invaders currently occupying it. I checked the face of my wristwatch. 22 minutes had passed since Brad drove his armored vehicle away. I had exactly 8 minutes left before the ruthless architect of this nightmare returned to the house. The traps were set and waiting, but to spring them effectively, to know exactly when and how to strike without catching my daughter in the deadly crossfire, I needed critical real-time intelligence. I needed to see the precise physical layout of the enemy stronghold. I needed to look directly into the belly of the beast. I walked down the hallway and stood before the reinforced wooden door leading down to the basement stairs. The heavy industrial padlock hung mockingly from the new thick steel hasp that had been drilled into the frame. But the padlock was merely a secondary measure, likely only used when Brad was completely away from the property. The primary insurmountable barrier was the black biometric fingerprint scanner mounted flush against the white wooden doorframe. A tiny red light pulsed steadily from the optical sensor, waiting patiently for an authorized biological input to grant access. I stared intently at the dark glass of the scanner, feeling the smooth plastic of its outer casing with my thumb. My newly modified electrical surge could instantly cripple their equipment, and my highly pressurized pipes could rapidly flood their entire operation, but I could not safely execute any tactical maneuvers without knowing exactly where they kept Sarah during the day and exactly where the heavily armed guards were permanently stationed. My entire defensive strategy absolutely hinged on seeing the basement layout. The invisible clock was ticking down relentlessly each passing second, bringing Brad closer and closer to the front door. I stood before the completely impenetrable barrier, staring at the pulsing red light of the scanner, knowing my engineering skills could not fake a human fingerprint, and understanding that I was entirely locked out of the war zone. I stood before the completely impenetrable barrier, staring at the pulsing red light of the scanner, knowing my engineering skills could not fake a human fingerprint, and understanding that I was entirely locked out of the war zone. But as I stared at the sleek black plastic casing mounted against the painted wood, the cold logic of my profession began to override my rising panic. A biometric lock is merely a sophisticated switch. It requires a biological input to send an electrical signal to a magnetic relay buried inside the doorframe. The scanner itself was not the actual lock. It was just the gatekeeper. And like any gatekeeper, it could be circumvented if you simply knocked down the wall it stood in front of. I did not need Brad's thumbprint to open this door. I simply needed to introduce my own electrical current directly into the magnetic relay, bypassing the scanner's logic board entirely. I stepped back from the doorframe and examined the surrounding hallway. To the left of the basement door stood a heavy antique oak console table, a piece my late wife had purchased decades ago at a flea market. It was laden with framed family photographs and a decorative ceramic lamp. It was the perfect visual shield. I quickly but silently slid the heavy table forward just enough to squeeze my body behind it. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor, pressing my back against the wall. I ran my hands over the smooth drywall directly adjacent to the doorframe. I knew the exact layout of the wiring studs behind this surface because I had placed them there myself during the initial construction of the house. The low-voltage wiring feeding that new scanner had to run down from the attic or up from the basement. Given the recent installation, Brad most likely fished the wires straight down the inner channel of the doorframe stud. I scrambled back into the garage, my heart hammering a steady rhythm against my ribs. I dug into my secondary toolbox, pulling out a sharp utility knife, a pair of wire strippers, and a heavy-duty 12-volt portable battery pack, normally used for jump-starting lawnmowers. I grabbed a set of thick copper jumper cables, their heavy metal teeth gleaming in the dim garage light. Armed with my makeshift breaching kit, I hurried back into the hallway, slipping behind the antique console table once again. I took a deep breath to steady my hands gripping the utility knife tightly. I pressed the sharp tip of the blade against the painted drywall roughly 10 inches below the level of the biometric scanner. I began to cut. I moved the blade with agonizing slowness, slicing through the thick gypsum board. The scratching sound of the blade felt deafening in the silent house, but I knew the thick walls would muffle the noise before it reached the upstairs bedrooms. I carved a perfect 6-inch square, keeping the lines sharp and clean. With a gentle pry of the blade, I popped the square piece of drywall out, setting it softly on the floor. I reached my fingers into the dark, dusty wall cavity. I felt the rough grain of the wooden stud, my fingertips searching the vertical channel. A moment later, I found them. Two thin insulated wires, one red and one black, running taut down the side of the wood. This was the lifeline. This was the low-voltage feed powering the magnetic lock holding my basement door shut. I pulled the wire loop slightly forward out of the wall cavity, giving myself just enough slack to work. Using the wire strippers, I carefully pinched the red casing, peeling back a tiny sections to expose the gleaming copper wire underneath. I repeated the process on the black ground wire. My hands were perfectly steady now. The fear had completely vanished, replaced by the absolute singular focus of a craftsman executing a complex task. I reached for the portable 12-volt battery pack, setting it silently on the floor beside my knees. I connected the negative black jumper cable to the battery terminal, then carefully clipped the heavy metal teeth onto the exposed section of the black ground wire protruding from the wall. I paused, listening intently to the house. The absolute silence above told me Brad had not yet returned from his meeting with the corrupted police escort. I had only minutes left before his vehicle pulled back into the driveway. I connected the positive red cable to the battery pack. I took the other end of the cable holding the heavy metal clamp just an inch away from the exposed copper of the red wire. This was the critical moment. If I miscalculated the voltage requirement, I could fry the relay permanently into a locked position, sealing the door forever. But if I was right, a direct surge of 12 volts would overload the magnetic coil, forcing it to release its grip on the steel strike plate. I took one final breath, gritted my teeth, and clamped the red jumper cable onto the exposed wire. A sharp, bright blue spark hissed in the dim space behind the console table. A localized popping sound echoed within the wall cavity, accompanied by the faint smell of burning ozone. And then the sound I had been praying for resonated through the hallway. It was a heavy, satisfying metallic clack. The industrial magnetic relay had failed under the sudden surge of raw voltage. The locking bolt snapped back into the housing. I immediately disconnected the jumper cables, shutting off the power source. I pushed myself up from the floor, ignoring the sharp protest of my arthritic knees, and stepped out from behind the antique table. I grasped the polished brass handle of the basement door. I turned it slowly. The mechanism yielded without any resistance. The door was completely unlocked. I pulled the heavy wooden door toward me, opening it just a few inches. A violent rush of freezing air blasted up from the stairwell, hitting my face like a physical blow. Brad had drastically lowered the ambient temperature down there, likely to keep the heavy machinery from overheating in the enclosed space. But the cold was not the most shocking element. It was the smell. The faint chemical odor I had detected from the attic the night before was now an overpowering, suffocating stench. It was a toxic, burning mixture of industrial bleach, harsh solvent fumes, and the sharp, unmistakable metallic tang of fresh printing ink. It burned the back of my throat, forcing me to swallow hard against the rising bile. I stepped onto the top landing, easing the door partially shut behind me to block the light from the hallway. The stairwell was bathed in a harsh, pale blue luminescence leaking up from the main basement floor. I began my descent. I moved with agonizing deliberation, placing my feet on the extreme outer edges of the wooden treads where the supporting stringers were the strongest, completely avoiding the center of the steps where the wood was most likely to groan or creak under my weight. I counted each step, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my breastbone. The mechanical clicking of the currency counters grew louder and more distinct with every downward movement. I reached the bottom landing, my back pressed tightly against the cool concrete foundation wall. I stood in the shadows just before the corner that opened up into the main expanse of the basement. I tightened my grip on the heavy steel pipe wrench I had brought from the garage, my only crude weapon against whatever awaited me. The high-grade chemical filtration system hummed with a deep vibrating intensity, masking the sound of my ragged breathing. I slowly edged my head past the corner of the concrete wall, forcing myself to look into the space I had once used to store old holiday decorations and forgotten family heirlooms. I peered into the pale blue light, and the horrifying scope of the operation finally revealed itself. The entire basement had been completely transformed overnight. The space was dominated by 3 massive industrial printing presses, their heavy steel rollers churning with rhythmic precision, stamping sheets of high-grade currency paper with flawless counterfeit $100 bills. Millions of dollars in fake currency flowed down the conveyor belts in a continuous, mesmerizing stream. At the far end of the room, 2 masked mercenaries stood watch, their tactical rifles resting casually across their chests. They were intensely focused on the 2 enormous currency counting machines, snapping through stacks of freshly laundered legitimate bills, bundling them into thick bricks. The crates I had seen earlier were stacked haphazardly against the far wall, their lids thrown open to reveal rows of heavy weaponry and vacuum-sealed packages of what looked like pure narcotics. I pulled my head back into the shadows, gripping the wrench until my fingers ached. Brad was not just laundering money. He was operating a massive, highly sophisticated counterfeit and distribution hub directly under my floorboards. And he planned to burn it all down with my daughter and me inside the moment his brother-in-law was murdered. I realized I could not just wait for the police. I had to dismantle this entire operation myself right now, using the very foundation of my home as my weapon. I stepped out from the dark, freezing shadows of the basement stairwell, moving with a silent, calculated grace that completely belied my 70 years. The 2 heavily armed, masked mercenaries, stationed at the far end of the cavernous room, were entirely absorbed in their monotonous task, their attention securely locked on the rhythmic, high-speed snapping of the industrial currency counters. They had their backs turned toward me, their matte black tactical rifles slung loosely over their broad shoulders, clearly brimming with absolute confidence in the impenetrable biometric security of the reinforced door I had just bypassed. I crept along the damp foundation wall, keeping my breathing shallow, and even utilizing the towering stacks of illicit cargo as a makeshift visual barricade. This was not a temporary storage space for a flooded real estate office. It was a highly sophisticated, fully operational black market transit hub constructed directly into the bedrock of my family home. Massive wooden pallets were lined up meticulously against the reinforced structural pillars I had poured decades ago, each one stacked impossibly high with vacuum-sealed bricks of dirty cash. The raw volume of the illegal currency was absolutely staggering, easily representing tens of millions of dollars, waiting patiently to be washed, processed, and ultimately shipped out to offshore accounts. The sheer scale of the vast criminal enterprise Brad had orchestrated right under my nose was breathtaking in its violent audacity. I moved deeper into the frigid room, my heavy steel pipe wrench gripped tightly in my sweating right hand, my eyes frantically scanning the fluorescent-lit space for the central nervous system of this underground fortress. Situated directly in the center of the room, cordoned off by temporary sound-dampening acoustic partitions, sat a massive polished mahogany desk. It looked entirely absurd and completely out of place in the harsh industrial setting of my basement, serving as a stark physical symbol of Brad's unquestioned authority over this entire operation. I glided toward the imposing piece of furniture, constantly keeping a watchful eye on the 2 mercenaries, who were still deeply mesmerized by the flashing digital displays of the rapid money counters. As I cautiously slipped behind the heavy wooden desk, the toxic stench of industrial bleach and fresh printing ink made my eyes burn, but I violently forced myself to focus on the myriad of scattered documents littering the pristine leather blotter. I fully expected to see counterfeit ledgers, encrypted offshore banking routing numbers, or detailed logistics manifests outlining global narcotics shipments. Instead, my terrified eyes immediately locked onto a thick manila folder prominently stamped with a crimson, unmistakable seal. It was a classified federal document. The remaining warmth in my blood ran completely cold as I instantly recognized the official golden insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I carefully, silently flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. The very first page was a highly detailed, comprehensive, and dangerously current surveillance dossier focusing exclusively on my son Matthew. It contained his current undisclosed safehouse address, his erratic daily operational schedule, his supposedly secure encrypted communication frequencies, and a terrifyingly granular breakdown of the specific elite organized crime task force he was currently commanding. Brad was not just casually evading Matthew's ongoing federal investigation. He was actively, systematically monitoring every single tactical move the federal agency made, staying 3 steps ahead of the very people trying to hunt him down. I flipped through the crisp pages with severely trembling fingers, a wave of horror washing over my body as I realized the catastrophic depth of the intelligence breach. Brad had completely compromised a highly classified federal investigation, putting my son and every single agent on his specialized team in immediate mortal danger. Scattered haphazardly next to the physical printed dossiers was a sleek silver laptop, its screen glowing softly in the dim blue-tinged basement light. A digital folder remained open on the busy desktop, displaying a highly organized directory of encrypted files. My scanning eyes traced down the long column of alphanumeric file names, stopping abruptly on 2 highly specific documents that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones. The first file was saved on the desktop exactly as Quang Mao 1_12.docx. Directly beneath that first entry, neatly categorized within a subfolder labeled Surveillance Protocols, lay another damning piece of digital evidence. It was explicitly cataloged under the precise designation of Quang Mao 2_12.docx. The strictly clinical naming conventions of these particular digital documents strongly suggested a long-term, highly calculated, and relentlessly methodical surveillance operation aimed directly at my family. I looked up slowly from the softly glowing computer screen, my gaze drawn irresistibly to a large rectangular cork timeline board mounted securely on the acoustic partition standing directly behind the mahogany desk. It was obsessively covered in high-resolution glossy photographs, intersecting lines of colored string, and incredibly precise handwritten notes, completely connected by a complex, terrifying web of red pushpins. I stepped closer, my breath catching painfully in my throat, as the absolute horrifying true nature of Brad's grand sinister design finally materialized before my widening eyes. The meticulously detailed timeline board did not document the illicit flow of laundered cartel money or the complex geographical distribution of heavy narcotics. Instead, it documented the systematic, predatory, and profoundly evil infiltration of my own family. The timeline board officially began exactly 3 years ago, featuring dozens of candid long-range covert surveillance photographs of Sarah casually walking to her favorite local coffee shop, quietly studying at the municipal library, and running everyday errands. Pinned directly next to her stolen photographs were highly detailed typed psychological profiles, thoroughly mapping out her deepest emotional vulnerabilities, her predictable daily routines, and her unwavering connection to her older brother Matthew. Brad had never accidentally bumped into my beautiful daughter at that crowded charity gala downtown. He had never organically fallen in love with her warm smile, her sharp intellect, or her gentle, forgiving spirit. He had actively, maliciously targeted her with the cold, ruthless, and terrifying precision of a highly trained military sniper. The taut red strings stretched across the corkboard connected Sarah directly to Matthew's active federal task force, and then a thick black line traced dramatically downward, connecting Matthew to a highly detailed, large-scale topographical map of my specific property. The handwritten tactical notes pinned beside the map aggressively highlighted my home's extremely isolated geographical location near the quiet county line, the thick, impenetrable surrounding woods, and my extensive, highly documented professional background in complex structural engineering. Brad desperately needed a perfectly secure, completely inconspicuous, heavily fortified fortress to safely run his massive, violent, illicit empire, and he knew a dedicated federal agent's unassuming family home was the ultimate, untouchable, perfect blind spot. He had coldly, methodically seduced my innocent daughter, deceitfully married her in front of our friends, and systematically poisoned her with heavy, debilitating sedatives, all to smoothly gain unrestricted, unquestioned access to my basement. Sarah was absolutely never a true, genuinely cherished, and deeply loved wife to him. She was merely a functional biological key utilized to deliberately and forcefully unlock a highly strategic geographical location, a tragic, completely disposable pawn in a cold, deadly game of violent chess. I stood frozen in the pale blue light of the basement, struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal methodically laid out before me. The timeline board was a terrifying monument to pure, calculating evil. Brad had not just invaded my physical home, he had stolen my daughter's life, reducing her entire existence to a mere tactical stepping stone. The rapid thumping of the currency counters seemed to mock the frantic pounding of my own heart. I took a slow step back from the mahogany desk, my eyes darting across the illicit empire. As I scanned the perimeter, I noticed a bank of flat-screen monitors mounted to the cold concrete wall, hidden behind the massive printing presses. They displayed high-resolution infrared security feeds of the property exterior. Brad had wired the entire perimeter of my land. I stared at the glowing screens, calculating my exit strategy, when a sudden blur of motion caught my attention on the top right monitor. The unmistakable sound of heavy rubber tires screeching violently against my asphalt driveway echoed through the floorboards above my head. Brad was back incredibly early. He was not supposed to return for another 20 minutes. I stepped cautiously toward the glowing monitors, my eyes widening in absolute horror at the unfolding scene. A black, heavily armored luxury SUV slammed to a violent halt just inches from the closed garage door. But it was not alone. Parked diagonally across the end of my long driveway, completely blocking the only exit to the main road, was a marked county police cruiser. The flashing red and blue emergency lights painted the surrounding woods in a harsh, chaotic strobe effect. The driver's side doors of both heavy vehicles opened simultaneously. Brad stepped out into the morning air looking tense and hurried. From the police cruiser emerged a man I recognized instantly, sending a fresh wave of ice water through my veins. It was Sheriff Miller. I had known Miller personally for over 15 years. I had attended local community barbecues with him and cheerfully donated to his political campaigns. Now I watched him casually adjust his heavy leather utility belt and walk shoulder to shoulder with a ruthless cartel operator. The deep corruption Brad had casually mentioned on his secure phone call was no longer a theoretical threat. It was physically parking directly in my driveway. They marched briskly toward the front door, their rigid body language projecting an urgent, lethal intent. The heavy brass handle of the front door clicked loudly above me, followed instantly by the solid, unmistakable thud of the deadbolt locking firmly into place. The floorboards of the main hallway groaned heavily under their combined weight. They were moving incredibly fast, their boots striking the hardwood with aggressive, purposeful strides. They were heading directly for the basement door. I spun around, my eyes desperately scanning the cavernous room for any viable avenue of escape. The wooden staircase was my only conventional exit, but traversing it now was absolute suicide. If I took a single step onto those wooden treads, I would be caught completely exposed in the narrow stairwell, fatally trapped between a heavily armed mercenary squad found below and a corrupt law enforcement officer above. There was no rear exit. The small ground-level ventilation windows were permanently sealed with thick iron grates I had meticulously installed myself decades ago. I was entirely hopelessly boxed in. The chilling sound of a key sliding roughly into the heavy industrial padlock echoed down the stairwell, a sharp metallic scraping that signaled my imminent execution. Fear threatened to completely paralyze my nervous system, but the cold, highly disciplined logic of my engineering profession aggressively pushed the rising panic aside. I knew the structural anatomy of this house better than anyone on Earth. I intimately knew the hidden secrets buried behind the pristine drywall. I darted away from the security monitors, sprinting silently past the massive printing presses and the towering pallets of dirty cash. The two masked mercenaries turned their heads toward the sound of the unlocking door above, momentarily ignoring my fleeting shadow. I moved swiftly toward the far corner of the basement, plunging into the deep shadows situated directly behind the massive central heating and cooling unit. 30 years ago, when I originally drafted the blueprints for this family home, my late wife had specifically requested a laundry chute connecting the upstairs master bathroom directly down to the basement utility area. I had built it exactly to her demanding specifications, constructing a perfectly smooth vertical shaft lined tightly with polished sheet aluminum. However, during a major interior renovation 10 years later, we had relocated the laundry machines to the main floor. The basement opening of the old chute was permanently sealed off with a false panel of drywall, completely forgotten by everyone but the man who had drawn the architectural plans. I dropped to my knees on the cold concrete, my fingers frantically tracing the invisible painted seams in the drywall paneling directly behind the heavy ductwork. I found the slight familiar depression in the dried joint compound. I gripped the textured handle of my heavy steel pipe wrench and brought the flat side of the solid metal head crashing down violently against the painted wall. The drywall shattered inward with a dull, hollow crunch. I ripped the broken, jagged pieces away with my bare hands, completely ignoring the sharp edges tearing at my fragile skin and the thick cloud of white gypsum dust rapidly filling my lungs. A dark, narrow vertical tunnel instantly opened up before my face. The polished aluminum interior caught the pale blue basement light. Above me, the heavy industrial padlock clattered loudly against the wooden doorframe. The primary biometric scanner beeped sharply, a harsh, piercing electronic chirp confirming Brad's authorized biological access. The heavy steel hasp violently disengaged. They were coming down. I thrust my arms deeply into the narrow chute, reaching blindly upward to grip the rough structural wooden framing that rigidly supported the smooth aluminum lining. I forced my head and broad shoulders into the incredibly tight, restrictive opening. The space was incredibly small, designed strictly for dropping soft linens, not for accommodating the wide frame of a full-grown man. The cold, unyielding metal pressed painfully against my chest and spine, severely restricting my ability to breathe. I pulled upward with my arms, my aging biceps burning fiercely as I dragged my 70-year-old body aggressively into the dark, vertical shaft. My heavy work boots scraped loudly against the broken drywall edge as I kicked my legs up, absolutely desperate to clear the opening before the men descended the stairs. The required physical exertion was monumental. Every single arthritic joint in my body screamed in violent, agonizing protest, a searing, white-hot flash of pure agony radiating viciously through my lower back and stiff shoulders. I ground my teeth together so hard my jaw ached, refusing to make even the faintest sound of discomfort. Utilizing every ounce of my remaining strength, I successfully managed to pull my feet from the basement space, my rigid body wedged impossibly tight within the narrow column as the basement door swung open. I held my breath, my chest compressed so tightly against the smooth aluminum lining that I felt my ribs might crack under the immense crushing pressure. Directly below my dangling feet, the heavy wooden door slammed aggressively against the interior basement wall, the sound reverberating through my bones. Brad and Sheriff Miller marched onto the bottom landing. Their footsteps were heavy and remarkably confident, but that absolute confidence shattered the exact moment they reached the primary entrance and observed the sparking wires. I heard Brad let out a sharp, guttural curse that vibrated up the metal shaft like a physical shockwave. The polished, professional veneer he constantly maintained completely evaporated in a single instant, replaced by raw, unfiltered malice. He shouted at the corrupt sheriff, violently demanding to know exactly how the magnetic lock had been bypassed without triggering the central alarm system he had personally installed. Miller stammered a highly confused, pathetic response, clearly out of his depth and entirely terrified of the monster he had willingly partnered with for dirty cash. I could clearly hear the distinct, terrifying sound of Brad racking the slide of a semi-automatic handgun, a chilling mechanical click that promised imminent violence. He knew immediately that his impenetrable fortress had been breached by a hostile force. He knew the clueless old man was not currently out in the front garden inspecting the fragile rose bushes as previously assumed. I knew I could not safely remain suspended in the lower section of the shaft for long. If Brad looked closely at the shattered drywall panel hiding directly behind the central heating unit, he would simply shine a high-powered tactical flashlight straight up the narrow chute and ruthlessly shoot me through the thin, unyielding metal. I immediately began to climb. I firmly pressed the thick rubber soles of my heavy work boots against the smooth back of the square shaft, pushing my broad shoulders firmly against the front panel to create friction. Using this incredibly crude leverage, I shimmied upward painfully, gaining an agonizing inch at a time. The aluminum walls were slick with condensation and completely unyielding against my fragile bones, acting like a rigid vertical vice. The physical agony in my aging spine was absolutely blinding, a sharp, tearing sensation that violently threatened to overwhelm my conscious mind and send me plummeting downward. But the terrifying sounds frantically echoing from the basement fueled my desperate, agonizing ascent toward survival. Brad was furiously barking severe orders at the two masked mercenaries, aggressively commanding them to immediately secure the massive pallets of cash and hastily prepare for an unscheduled rapid extraction. The carefully planned timeline had exponentially accelerated into pure chaos. He finally realized his perfect cover was blown, and he was rapidly pivoting to a violently aggressive contingency plan that involved eliminating all loose ends. I eventually reached the precise level of the main floor, my lungs burning for clean oxygen. The vertical laundry chute passed directly behind the insulated walls of the guest bathroom before continuing up to the master suite on the second story. When I originally framed this sprawling house 30 years ago, I deliberately installed a small wooden access panel inside the guest bathroom linen closet to easily service the complex plumbing pipes running parallel to the chute. I found the interior seam of the aluminum chute where the separate metal sections perfectly joined together in the darkness. I pressed my aching back against the opposite side of the shaft and delivered a vicious, highly concentrated kick to the metal joint directly adjacent to the wooden access panel. The aluminum instantly buckled and popped outward with a loud, protesting metallic groan that sounded like a gunshot. I aggressively squeezed my right shoulder through the jagged, broken opening, painfully tearing my flannel shirt and deeply slicing the soft flesh of my left arm. But I successfully managed to grip the sturdy wooden framing of the linen closet. I pulled my battered, bleeding body out of the vertical tomb, collapsing heavily onto the soft folded towels neatly stacked on the lower closet shelves. I lay there in the dark, gasping silently for necessary oxygen, my exhausted muscles shaking uncontrollably from the extreme surging adrenaline and the profound physical trauma I had just miraculously endured. Before I could even attempt to properly catch my breath and assess my bleeding wounds, I heard Brad aggressively storming up the wooden basement stairs. His heavy tactical boots pounded against the wooden treads with a terrifying, unhinged violence that shook the floorboards beneath me. He was absolutely no longer playing the charming, loving son-in-law who brought expensive wine to Sunday dinners. He was a completely cornered, extremely dangerous, and highly lethal predator, relentlessly hunting his elusive prey. I pushed the louvered wooden closet door open just a tiny fraction of an inch, granting my straining eyes a narrow, unobstructed view of the main hallway and the wide entrance leading directly into the formal living room. Brad marched directly into the downstairs den, where he had previously isolated my highly vulnerable daughter under false pretenses. A few agonizing seconds later, he violently emerged, forcefully dragging Sarah by the delicate collar of her expensive silk blouse. Her bare feet dragged lifelessly across the polished hardwood floor, leaving faint, disturbing marks on the pristine surface. She was completely incapacitated by whatever heavy chemical cocktail he had maliciously forced into her delicate system to keep her compliant. Her head rolled loosely to the side, her eyelids fluttering weakly, but totally unable to focus on her terrifying surroundings. He tossed her roughly onto the absolute center of the large living room rug, like a completely discarded broken rag doll, completely devoid of any human empathy. Brad stood aggressively over her fragile, motionless form, his broad chest heaving with uncontrollable, murderous rage. He reached down to his dark tactical belt and swiftly drew a matte black Glock pistol, the cold steel barrel gleaming menacingly in the bright morning sunlight, currently streaming through the large bay windows of the living room. He aimed the deadly weapon directly down at the head of my entirely helpless daughter, his index finger resting dangerously close to the highly sensitive trigger. He turned his head sharply, his frantic eyes meticulously scanning the empty hallways and the high vaulted ceilings of my sprawling home, searching for any sign of my presence. He took a deep, steadying breath, and his booming voice shattered the quiet morning, completely stripped of any remaining humanity, echoing through the entire house with a clear, highly lethal intent. "I know you are hiding somewhere in this house, old man," Brad shouted loudly, his harsh words dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You really think you are clever crawling around in the walls like a pathetic, frightened rat, but you cannot hide from me forever. I am completely done playing the polite, caring family man for you. The stupid game is completely over. I know you saw the basement. I know you know exactly what I am doing down there. Come out of the shadows right now and sign the primary insurance transfer papers immediately, or I swear to God I will shoot her right now." I watched through the narrow wooden slats of the guest bathroom closet door, my breath catching in my throat. Brad stood over my incapacitated daughter, with his weapon drawn, his finger rigid against the trigger of the matte black pistol. The heavy footsteps I had heard earlier finally materialized into the living room. Sheriff Miller stepped into my line of sight, his uniform badge gleaming sickeningly. He carried a customized tactical shotgun, quickly pumping the action with a sharp, intimidating clack that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He swept the dark barrel in a wide arc, aggressively covering Brad's exposed flank, his eyes darting toward the empty hallways. They were a unified front of corruption and violence, fully prepared to execute my daughter and hunt me down in my own home. The sheer audacity of their presence crystallized the cold anger burning inside my chest. I gently released the louvered door, allowing it to swing shut silently. I backed away into the shadows of the bathroom. I did not need to face a loaded shotgun. I needed to fundamentally alter the battlefield. When I installed the integrated smart home communication network a decade ago, I routed the central wiring hub directly through the drywall cavity located just behind the vanity mirror in this exact bathroom. I pulled my utility knife from my pocket and swiftly cut a small, neat rectangle into the drywall right beneath the polished sink. I reached my hands into the dark cavity, my fingers expertly navigating the familiar bundles of insulated wire. I located the thick control cable responsible for routing audio signals to the hidden ceiling speakers installed in every single room of the sprawling house. With precise, practiced movements, I stripped the protective casing and quickly spliced the exposed copper directly into the internal microphone wiring of the bathroom intercom station. By aggressively crossing these specific circuits, I effectively isolated the audio feed, granting myself overriding control of the entire broadcast system. I bypassed Brad's sophisticated network jammers and locked out any secondary input from the other control panels. I was now the sole voice of the house. I gripped the small plastic microphone unit mounted to the tiled wall, taking a deep, steadying breath to calm my racing heart. I depressed the transmission button. A loud, sharp burst of electronic feedback immediately shrieked from the hidden ceiling speakers throughout the entire property, a harsh, piercing whine that instantly shattered the tense silence of the living room. I looked through the crack in the door and saw both men flinch violently. Sheriff Miller instinctively raised his shotgun, aiming wildly at the empty ceiling, his face paling with sudden confusion. Brad spun around in a frantic circle, his pistol wavering, searching for the source of the deafening noise. I brought the microphone directly to my lips, my voice heavily amplified and echoing simultaneously from the kitchen. The dining room, the upstairs hallway, and the living room boomed through the house with absolute, terrifying authority. You think I spent 40 years building this house without knowing how to tear it down? I said, my tone completely devoid of fear, vibrating with cold architectural precision. Brad physically recoiled, taking a sudden step back from Sarah. His eyes widened in absolute shock as my disembodied voice surrounded him from every conceivable angle. He aimed his weapon at the ceiling speaker above the fireplace, completely disoriented by the acoustic assault. "Where are you, you old fool, Brad?" screamed, his voice cracking, with a sudden, undeniable layer of panic. "Show yourself right now. I am not playing games with you." I depressed the transmission button again, keeping my voice steady and unnervingly calm. "You are standing in a perfectly engineered machine, Brad," I broadcasted smoothly, letting my words echo ominously down the corridors. "And you made the fatal mistake of assuming you were the one at the controls. You are nothing but a trespasser. This structure obeys me." Sheriff Miller looked completely terrified. He backed slowly toward the heavy oak front door, his shotgun trembling visibly in his sweating hands. "Brad," he stammered loudly, his voice shaking with raw fear. "We need to secure the perimeter. We need to fall back and sweep the house from the outside. He has the entire system rigged. Nobody is leaving!" Brad roared, turning his pistol furiously toward the corrupt sheriff for a fraction of a second. "We finish this right now. He is just an old man playing tricks with a microphone. Find the breaker panel and shut down the power." I smiled grimly in the dark bathroom. He had absolutely no idea what he was walking into. I released the microphone and dropped to the floor, crawling quickly toward the heavy heating vent located near the baseboard. This specific vent connected directly to the primary structural cavity running beneath the formal dining room floor, precisely where I had previously wired my makeshift electrical trap. I reached my arm deeply into the dusty metal duct, my fingers desperately stretching toward the thick gauge copper wires I had carefully routed there just 20 minutes prior. My fingertips brushed against the heavy plastic casing of the master switch. I grasped the heavy toggle switch firmly in my hand. Through the open vent, I could hear Brad storming aggressively toward the main hallway alcove, moving exactly toward the compromised electrical panel I had deliberately sabotaged. He was walking blindly into the trap, completely unaware that the safety relays were entirely bypassed, and the ungrounded current was primed to surge. But I was not just going to fry his basement operation. I was going to systematically blind and drown them. I listened intently as Brad ripped the metal cover off the hallway breaker box. "What the hell is this?" he muttered angrily, staring at the completely reconfigured maze of wires. I closed my eyes and forcefully threw the hidden master switch. The violent reaction was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic. The massive, ungrounded electrical load of the entire house surged aggressively backward through the spliced circuits, completely bypassing the standard safety breakers. A deafening explosive crack echoed violently through the walls as the raw, unregulated voltage slammed directly into the custom smart home mainframe mounted in the utility closet. The delicate logic boards and highly sensitive processors were instantly incinerated in a blinding flash of bright blue electrical arcing. Simultaneously, the immense electrical surge triggered the secondary trap I had meticulously laid. The sudden violent shift in power caused the manipulated pressure reducing valves in the main plumbing manifold to completely fail. Without the vital regulators holding back the immense municipal water pressure, the heavy flow slammed violently against the closed copper pipes with a catastrophic high-pressure water hammer effect. The sheer kinetic force instantly shattered the primary brass joints hidden behind the drywall. A thunderous roar of rushing, freezing water erupted from the destroyed walls. The volatile mixture of raw electricity and highly pressurized water created a massive short circuit that completely blew out the main transformer. The sprawling property was instantly plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The heavy electric locks jammed permanently shut, trapping Brad and the terrified sheriff inside the dark, flooded vault. The abrupt absence of light was absolute. The sprawling house, once a beacon of modern luxury, was instantly transformed into a pitch-black, hermetically sealed concrete box. The motorized shutters I installed on the living room windows triggered their fail-safe mechanisms the moment the grid failed, slamming downward with a metallic finality that blocked out the sun. The air was thick with the scent of vaporized copper wiring and the rising stench of municipal water tearing through the ruptured drywall in the adjoining corridors. The chaotic symphony of rushing water and groaning timber echoed through the dark space, drowning out the frantic breathing of the two armed men trapped below me. I did not need the sun to see. I had drafted every single blueprint, driven every single nail, and laid every single plank of hardwood in this structure. I intimately knew the exact distance from the guest bathroom to the second-floor mezzanine. I knew precisely which floorboards would creak under a heavy boot, and I knew how to move across the high vaulted spaces with the silent predatory grace of a ghost haunting its own grave. I crept out of the guest bathroom, stepping lightly onto the thick carpet of the upstairs landing. Below me, the living room was submerged in an inky darkness. Brad was losing control of his meticulously cultivated composure. "What is happening?" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic as he blindly stumbled backward over the edge of a heavy leather sofa. "Fix the power right now, Miller. Use your flashlight and find the backup generator." The corrupt sheriff was breathing in ragged, terrifying gasps. "The doors are completely deadlocked," Miller shouted back, the distinct sound of heavy tactical gear shifting in the dark as he frantically pawed at the unyielding front entrance. "The electronic deadbolts are frozen solid. We are locked inside. I cannot see a single thing in here." I moved silently along the polished oak railing of the second-floor balcony, looking directly down over the expansive living room. The crystal chandelier hung suspended 20 feet above the center of the room, positioned over the coffee table. When I designed this space, I installed a steel pulley system hidden inside the attic to easily lower the 200-pound fixture for routine cleaning. The tension cable mechanism was anchored to a reinforced steel cleat, located just inches from where I was standing on the dark balcony. I reached into the deep pockets of my torn flannel shirt, my fingers wrapping firmly around the thick, rubberized handle of my heavy-duty wire cutters. I knelt on the soft carpet, sliding my hands along the wooden baseboard until I felt the cold steel of the tension cleat. I could hear the sheriff fumbling desperately with his utility belt, likely searching for a tactical illumination device. A narrow, blindingly bright beam of LED light suddenly sliced through the oppressive darkness, wildly illuminating the settling dust and the terrified, sweat-drenched face of Sheriff Miller. He was standing directly beneath the massive crystal chandelier, aiming his shotgun nervously at the shadows dancing across the ruined drywall. This was my exact moment. The laws of physics are absolute, completely devoid of mercy, prejudice, or hesitation. Gravity requires only a single decisive invitation to exert its magnificent, crushing authority. I slid the sharp steel jaws of my wire cutters around the thick, braided tension cable holding the massive chandelier aloft. With one smooth, incredibly forceful squeeze of my aching hands, the sharp blades bit cleanly through the braided steel. The heavy cable snapped with a violent metallic whip crack. The massive crystal chandelier instantly plummeted from the high-vaulted ceiling in a terrifying freefall. It fell exactly 20 feet in a fraction of a second, an avalanche of heavy brass framing and thousands of razor-sharp glass shards. The enormous fixture crashed directly onto Sheriff Miller, with a deafening, catastrophic explosion of shattering crystal and snapping metal. The impact was absolutely devastating. The corrupt law enforcement officer did not even have time to scream. The immense kinetic force of the 200-pound chandelier pinned him violently to the hardwood floor, completely neutralizing the shotgun he had been frantically waving just a second prior. His tactical flashlight clattered wildly across the room, rolling under a heavy armchair, and casting long, distorted, chaotic shadows across the ruined living room. Brad shrieked in absolute terror, instinctively throwing himself violently to the floor as the deadly shrapnel rained down around him. He blindly fired 3 rapid shots from his Glock pistol into the pitch-black ceiling, the bright muzzle flashes briefly illuminating his contorted, sweat-soaked face. The deafening roar of the gunfire echoed painfully in the enclosed space, followed by the sharp, metallic ping of bullets, hopelessly embedding themselves into the thick wooden support beams far above my head. I did not retreat. I used the chaotic, blinding distraction of his wild gunfire to make my final move. I silently swung my legs over the oak balcony railing, gripping a decorative architectural pillar with both of my calloused hands. I slid swiftly down the wooden column, dropping the final 10 feet to the main floor with a soft, practiced landing that made absolutely no sound. I was now on the same level as the predator, sharing the darkness, but holding the ultimate tactical advantage. I reached down to my leather tool belt, drawing my weapon. It was not a conventional firearm. It was a high-powered pneumatic nail gun. I had heavily modified the internal firing mechanism years ago, attaching a portable carbon dioxide canister directly to the intake valve. It did not require any electrical power to operate. It was fully primed, highly pressurized, and loaded with a thick coil of 3-inch galvanized steel framing nails. I stepped deliberately out from the shadows of the ruined living room, my boots crunching softly over the thick layer of shattered crystal. I raised the heavy yellow and black power tool, pointing the blunt metal muzzle directly toward the frantic, hyperventilating cartel operator. Brad was scrambling desperately on his hands and knees across the wet floor, completely terrified by the invisible, systematic destruction of his meticulously planned operation. His eyes darted wildly through the gloom, searching frantically for an exit that simply did not exist. His gaze finally landed on the motionless, heavily sedated form of Sarah, lying just a few feet away. Pure cowardly desperation completely overrode any remaining shred of rational thought in his panicked mind. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, aggressively grabbing my unconscious daughter by the collar of her silk blouse and hauling her limp body forcefully against his broad chest. He jammed the cold steel barrel of his pistol brutally against her temple, using her fragile, helpless frame as a physical shield against the darkness. He began to drag her violently backward, his heavy boots slipping on the pooling water, moving desperately toward the only remaining path he knew. He was frantically retreating toward the basement stairs. Brad roared into the darkness. "I know you're hiding, old man. Come out and sign the insurance transfer papers or I shoot her right now." I stepped out from the deep shadows of the ruined hallway, deliberately making my heavy work boots thud against the waterlogged hardwood floor. I moved to position myself precisely at the narrow precipice of the basement stairwell. The ambient light from the moon outside bled faintly through the shattered front windows, casting long silhouettes. The roaring sound of the ruptured plumbing, echoing from the utility corridor, provided a chaotic, deafening soundtrack to our final confrontation. Brad abruptly halted his desperate backward scramble. He dropped Sarah roughly onto the soaked carpet at the edge of the stairwell, landing, freeing his hands to deal with the immediate threat. He raised his matte black pistol, tracking my movement through the gloom, the cold steel barrel leveling directly at the absolute center of my chest. I did not raise the pneumatic nail gun. I kept the heavy power tool lowered, resting it casually against my thigh, as if it were nothing more than a harmless hammer. I stood completely still, locking my eyes onto the desperate predator standing just 5 feet away from me. The corrupt sheriff was entirely incapacitated under the crushed weight of the massive crystal chandelier in the adjacent room, leaving Brad completely alone, cornered, and entirely stripped of his meticulously crafted civilized facade. "You really thought you could just trap me in here?" Brad sneered, his voice vibrating with a toxic, unstable mixture of pure terror and arrogant bravado. He took a cautious, aggressive step forward, kicking a piece of shattered drywall out of his path. His chest heaved violently as he tightened his two-handed grip on the firearm. "You ruined my entire operation. You flooded the basement. You destroyed millions of dollars in untraceable cartel currency. Do you have absolutely any idea what those people are going to do to me when they find out about this catastrophic mess?" "They will likely do exactly what you intended to do to my innocent family," I replied softly, my voice calm. "They will eradicate a completely disposable asset. You are nothing but a failed architect of your own destruction, Brad. You built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and you fundamentally misunderstood the basic laws of structural integrity." Brad let out a harsh, incredulous bark of laughter, shaking his head wildly as he kept the pistol aimed steadily at my heart. "You are completely delusional," he spat. You are standing there with a construction tool trying to lecture me about structural integrity while I am holding a loaded Glock. You have absolutely no tactical advantage here. You are just a weak old man playing dangerous games you cannot possibly comprehend. I am going to put a bullet straight through your chest, step over your pathetic bleeding corpse, and I am going to drag your precious daughter out of this house to use her as my absolute guarantee of safe passage. He took another step toward the stairwell, firmly planting his left boot on the very edge of the heavy steel threshold. He had unwittingly positioned himself perfectly within the primary strike zone. When I originally framed this specific section of the house 3 decades ago, I installed a commercial-grade, highly insulated steel fire door to safely separate the residential living space from the hazardous utility basement. To ensure the massive metal door would automatically close in the event of a dangerous chemical fire, I had equipped it with a heavy-duty industrial hydraulic tension closer. I had completely bypassed the standard safety restrictors on that specific hydraulic mechanism, deliberately maximizing the internal pressure to its absolute most catastrophic physical threshold. I did not flinch as Brad aggressively advanced, closing the fatal distance between us. I did not attempt to raise the nail gun or beg for my life. Instead, I slowly, deliberately raised my free left hand and pressed my calloused palm flat against the damp, ruined drywall situated right next to the reinforced metal doorframe. I located the small, unassuming brass manual release valve I had carefully exposed earlier. "You are done talking, old man!" Brad growled, his finger whitening as it tightened deliberately against the sensitive trigger of the pistol. "Say goodbye to your miserable, pathetic life." I smiled, a cold, empty expression that finally sent a genuine shockwave of absolute terror across his sweating face. "I am not a weak old man, Brad," I whispered into the darkness. "I am the man who built this house." I viciously slammed the heel of my hand against the brass manual release valve. The immensely pressurized hydraulic cylinder instantly unleashed its pent-up catastrophic energy with a deafening mechanical shriek. The massive solid steel fire door violently swung shut with a terrifying, incalculable velocity. It moved far faster than any human reflex could possibly track. Brad did not even have the necessary fraction of a second required to pull his trigger or attempt to pull his body back from the dangerous threshold. The heavy steel slab slammed ruthlessly into the reinforced metal doorframe, with the explosive earth-shattering force of a high-speed vehicular collision. The incredibly violent impact caught Brad precisely on his extended right arm, right at the delicate joint of his elbow. The sickening wet crunch of completely shattering bone and snapping cartilage echoed sharply over the roaring sound of the rushing water. The heavy steel door brutally pinned his crushed, mangled limb against the unyielding frame, locking him instantly and permanently into a horrific, agonizing vice of cold metal and unimaginable physical torment. Brad unleashed a shrill, blood-curdling scream of pure, absolute agony, his voice tearing through the dark house like a wounded animal. The loaded Glock pistol immediately dropped from his instantly paralyzed, completely useless fingers, clattering loudly onto the soaked hardwood floor and sliding safely out of his reach. He collapsed heavily against the unyielding steel door, his knees buckling under the sheer, blinding shock of the catastrophic physical trauma, sobbing and gasping as the massive hydraulic pressure continuously crushed his trapped limb without an ounce of mercy. I did not waste a single second looking at his pathetic, writhing form. I immediately dropped the heavy pneumatic nail gun, kicking the discarded pistol far away into the shadows of the flooded hallway. I dropped straight down to my aching knees, completely ignoring the sharp glass and cold water soaking into my trousers, and desperately reached out toward my daughter. Sarah was still lying motionless on the floor, her face pale and still in the dim moonlight. I slipped my arms gently beneath her fragile, cold shoulders, lifting her safely from the wet carpet. I pulled her tightly against my chest, burying my tired face into her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against my own. The overwhelming terror of the past several hours finally broke, releasing an uncontrollable flood of profound emotional relief. I rocked her slowly in the cold, dark, whispering soft, comforting assurances into her ear, completely oblivious to the ruined house collapsing around us and the agonizing screams of the monster pinned to the wall. I held her close, finally, safe fiercely, protecting the only thing in the entire world that truly mattered to me. The deafening roar of the ruptured plumbing and the pathetic, agonizing whimpers of the trapped operator were eclipsed by a new piercing sound echoing from the long asphalt driveway. The unmistakable wail of multiple high-powered sirens cut sharply through the heavy, humid air of the dark morning. Intense flashes of brilliant red and blue emergency lights violently flooded the shattered front windows, casting wild, spinning shadows across the waterlogged walls of my ruined home. The harsh, chaotic illumination painted the floating debris and the sparkling shards of crushed crystal in a dizzying array of emergency colors. I could faintly hear the distinct dying whine of the sophisticated signal jammer Brad had hidden somewhere on the property. The massive electrical surge had not only fried the smart home mainframe, but it had completely overloaded his illicit communication blackout, forcefully dragging my isolated fortress back into the connected world. The terrifying isolation was finally over. I remained kneeling on the soaked carpet, keeping my body wrapped tightly around my unconscious daughter. My eyes locked on the front entrance. The jammed electronic deadbolts of the heavy oak front doors did not simply yield to the approaching authorities. They were completely eradicated. A massive kinetic breaching charge detonated against the reinforced wood with a chest-thumping explosion that shook the remaining drywall from the ceiling studs. The heavy doors were violently blown inward, crashing off their thick brass hinges and splashing heavily into the rising pool of water, flooding the primary foyer. A highly coordinated, heavily armed tactical strike team surged aggressively into the pitch-black house. Dozens of blinding white tactical flashlights instantly sliced through the gloomy wet air, crisscrossing the ruined formal living room and the adjacent corridors. The booming voices of federal agents commanded absolute authority, shouting strict orders to secure the perimeter. The disciplined operators moved with lethal, practiced precision, sweeping their rifles over the crushed chandelier, the immobilized sheriff, and the dark corners of the flooded hallway. From the center of the heavily armored federal agents, a single familiar silhouette pushed forward. The bright tactical lights illuminated his tall frame, and a fresh wave of profound relief washed over my exhausted soul. It was my son. Matthew was alive. He marched into the ruined living room, his dark FBI tactical gear heavily stained with wet mud and drywall dust. He looked absolutely battered, bearing the unmistakable physical evidence of a violent struggle. A dark purple bruise covered the left side of his jaw, and a jagged bleeding laceration traced a harsh line across his forehead, a clear testament to the brutal ambush he had successfully survived just hours prior. He was breathing heavily, his sharp eyes scanning the catastrophic destruction of his childhood home with a mixture of professional assessment and raw, deeply personal shock. He stepped carefully over the shattered glass, completely ignoring the moaning form of his former colleague by the fire door, and rushed directly toward the dark corner where I was now kneeling. Matthew dropped heavily to his knees in the water, his arms wrapping fiercely around both of us. We huddled together on the ruined floor, an unbreakable unit of blood and survival, shivering and completely silent in the aftermath of the unimaginable violence. He gently checked Sarah for a pulse, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of relief when he felt her steady heartbeat. He keyed the radio on his tactical vest, his voice cracking with emotion as he urgently called for the standby medical team to enter the structure. Within seconds, paramedics swarmed our position gently, lifting my daughter onto a rigid transport board and rushing her toward the flashing lights of the waiting ambulances outside. With his sister safely secured, the vulnerable brother transformed back into the hardened federal agent. Matthew stood up, his posture radiating absolute, uncompromising authority, and marched deliberately toward the heavy steel fire door. 2 tactical agents had already located the manual hydraulic release valve I had utilized, working together to slowly bleed the immense crushing pressure away from the heavy steel frame. As the metal door finally yielded, Brad collapsed limply onto the flooded hardwood, clutching his violently mangled arm against his chest. He was no longer the arrogant, polished mastermind who had ruthlessly invaded my home and threatened my family. He was a pathetic, sobbing, completely broken shell of a human being. His expensive designer clothes were soaked with dirty water and dark blood. His perfectly styled hair plastered wildly across his sweating forehead. Matthew stood over him, looking down with a cold, disgusted expression that carried the weight of federal justice. He roughly grabbed Brad by his uninjured shoulder, hauling the sobbing cartel operator forcefully to his knees. The harsh metallic sound of heavy steel handcuffs clamping securely around Brad's remaining functional wrist echoed sharply in the hallway. Brad slowly raised his tear-streaked face, his terrified, bloodshot eyes darting desperately from the heavily armed federal agents to my muddy, blood-stained work boots. The devastating reality of his total catastrophic failure finally crashed down upon his shattered ego. He had brought a mercenary squad, corrupt law enforcement, and millions in dirty cash into my territory, and he had been systematically dismantled, outmaneuvered, and utterly humiliated by a retired engineer, armed with a wire cutter and a deep knowledge of his own house. "I am ruined," Brad muttered weakly, his voice barely audible over the splashing boots of the federal agents. "You completely ruined me. You are just an old man. You are supposed to be a clueless old man. You clearly forgot to account for the foundation." I replied softly, my voice carrying the quiet strength of a father who had successfully protected his own. "Take him out of my house, Matthew." Matthew yanked Brad aggressively to his feet, handing the sobbing, humiliated criminal over to two heavily armed agents who dragged him roughly out the shattered front door. In the center of the living room, a separate team of federal agents was dragging the unconscious, heavily bruised body of Sheriff Miller out from underneath the shattered crystal chandelier. The corrupt law enforcement officer was securely shackled and unceremoniously carried away to face the absolute devastation of his own ruined career and impending federal prison sentence. The chaotic noise of the emergency response slowly began to fade into a manageable hum. The heavy tactical teams secured the remaining perimeter, cataloging the towering pallets of dirty cartel cash in the flooded basement and processing the massive crime scene. I stood slowly, my joints screaming in agonizing protest, and looked around at the catastrophic destruction of the beautiful home I had spent 4 decades building. The walls were torn open, the floors were submerged in dark water, and the expensive furniture was reduced to broken splinters. But as Matthew walked back across the ruined living room and wrapped his arms securely around my tired shoulders, pulling me into a tight, silent embrace, I knew, with absolute certainty, that the true foundation of my life remained perfectly intact. The walls could be rebuilt, the drywall replaced, but the family I fought so desperately to save was standing strong, unbroken, and breathing in the quiet, comforting dawn. The slow, agonizing passage of time finally yielded to the gentle arrival of dawn. Pale beams of golden sunlight crested over the quiet Seattle suburbs, stretching across the manicured lawns and casting long, revealing rays onto my property. The morning light slowly illuminated the sheer scale of the catastrophic destruction I had deliberately unleashed upon my own creation. The heavy front doors lay splintered and submerged in a shallow pool of murky water. The beautiful bay windows were shattered, reflecting the fading red and blue strobe lights of the remaining emergency vehicles parked strategically along the long asphalt driveway. The house was severely damaged, a chaotic monument to the violent struggle that had transpired within its walls. Yet as I breathed in the cool, crisp morning air, I felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace. The structure was broken, but my family was entirely whole. Sarah sat quietly on the wide wooden steps of the front porch. A kind, female paramedic had draped a thick thermal blanket over her trembling shoulders. The heavy toxic sedatives Brad had maliciously forced into her system were finally wearing off, leaving her exhausted, but undeniably lucid. She leaned her tired head against the thick wooden railing, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line. The crushing weight of the terrible secrets, the constant manipulation, and the dangerous marriage that had imprisoned her for years was finally lifted. She was entirely free from the monster, who had meticulously planned to use her life as a tactical stepping stone for a criminal syndicate. I walked slowly across the damp grass, my legs heavy and aching from the profound physical trauma of the night. I sat down heavily beside her on the cold wooden steps. My calloused, trembling hands reached out gently, wrapping around her fragile fingers. She squeezed my hand tightly, resting her head against my shoulder. No words were necessary. The silent, unbreakable bond of our shared survival spoke volumes. I looked up at the sprawling, ruined facade of the house I had spent 4 decades meticulously building. Every single nail, every carefully drafted blueprint, every drop of sweat I had poured into this property seemed entirely insignificant now. I realized with absolute clarity that its true structural integrity was never found in the premium lumber or the reinforced concrete. The true foundation of my life was my unwavering willingness to completely destroy it all to save my children. The sound of heavy tactical boots crunching over the gravel driveway pulled my attention away from the wreckage. Matthew walked deliberately toward the porch, his dark federal tactical gear still caked with dried mud and plaster dust. The jagged laceration on his forehead had been professionally bandaged, and the purple bruise on his jaw was stark against his pale skin. Despite the visible injuries from his own brutal firefight, a genuine relieved smile broke across his exhausted face. He carried 3 steaming paper cups of dark coffee in his large hands. He gently handed a warm cup to Sarah, and then passed one to me, taking a seat on the step just below us. He took a long, slow sip of the dark, hot liquid, looking out over the quiet suburban street. The massive criminal syndicate Brad had confidently brought into our lives was entirely dismantled. The corrupt local sheriff was locked away in a federal holding cell, and the millions in dirty cartel cash were securely seized. The terrifying nightmare was permanently over. I knew the coming days would bring countless federal inquiries, legal statements, and exhaustive architectural inspections. But looking at my resilient children breathing the fresh air together, I felt a deep, enduring comfort that completely washed away the lingering exhaustion of the long, violent night. We sat together in the gentle morning sunlight, a battered but completely unbroken family, ready to face the difficult task of rebuilding our lives from the ground up. People often make the fatal mistake of confusing old age with weakness. They assume that a quiet retirement makes a man obsolete, invisible, and easily manipulated. But true strength does not fade with gray hair. It simply learns to wait in the shadows. A father who spent his entire life building and protecting his family will never hesitate to tear the world apart to keep them safe. Betrayal thrives on the assumption of ignorance, but nothing is more dangerous than a patient man who knows exactly how to build a trap and has nothing left to lose but his family. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Have you ever had a gut feeling that saved your family from danger? Share your story in the comments below. See you in the next thrilling story.